All right. Well, first of all, my last name is actually pretty easy. It's Rulin.
Okay.
And Jim and I have worked together since 1996. So I guess I'm showing you a little bit of my age by telling you all that. But we have been running a crisis management firm since 2005, and we work with municipalities all over the country on a wide array of issues. Interestingly, lately, we've had a lot of issues with jail and prison related deaths that we've been dealing with, in addition to the excessive use of force cases that we work on all the time, as well as hashtag Me Too, sexual molestation, pretty much any type of crisis that an organization can experience, we've seen. And that's actually one of the things I want to get across to all of you, is that as a result of this relationship that we have with LGRMS, we want you to call us. We want you to call us if there's a circumstance, what we call a circumstance. Something happens, it's a little out of the ordinary. You're not sure how it's going to develop. You have an employee who quits and says, I'm coming back to get all you guys. We crisis risk, because that's the business we're in, have handled those things numerous times. That's not your day job. Don't try and handle those things yourself. We would love, as a result of our partnership with your organization, to assist you guys through that kind of stuff. So again, I just wanted to lay that out there before we got started. So with no further ado, I'm going to launch into the presentation, and let's see if I can get this thing to start. There we go. So I think a lot of the questions that we had prior to this presentation were about active shooter, and actually we refer to it as deadly weapons because we unfortunately wind up dealing with not only gun-related activity, but also knives, baseball bats, all type of weapons that are used with the intention of causing harm or death. So, all those things need to be considered. And, one of the things that we almost always get is that we never thought it could happen here. And that's what everybody thinks, it can't happen here until it does. And what we're trying to emphasize, if you take nothing away from this presentation today, other than the fact that it can happen and that there are things you can do to reduce the likelihood, what we would call the frequency or the severity of an event, that's what we want to help you do. So I think you guys are looked to as your community, by your communities as leaders. They're looking to you to lead those critical crisis decisions, but they're expecting that you're doing it now. They're not expecting that you're waiting for the event to occur and then first starting to think those things through. So a big part of how you start this process is by thinking about, what keeps you up at night? Have you had problems? For example, recently we handled a planning board situation where a person came in very angry, was armed, was carrying it was in an open carry state, which many of our states are, and they came in armed. Now, they didn't brandish the weapon, they didn't draw the weapon, but again, it creates a situation where, okay, how do we deal with this? So knowing what keeps you up at night, what are your major concerns? Also understanding what is a crisis. How do you compare one crisis with another? How do you manage them? All those things. I'm going to talk you through a little bit of that today. But when you think about the kind of things that keep you up at night, think about some of the recent claims that you've seen in the news. So, for example, I was talking to Dan just before we got started on this phone call, and I let him know. And by the way, I'll only talk about clients that are where the information is public. I will never divulge any non-public information. But for example, you saw that there was a shooting at the Garlic Festival in Gilroy, California. Now, Gilroy was not actually running the Garlic Festival. So while the municipality was involved because it took place at their park, they were leasing their park to a private entity. So when you think about the kind of exposures that your municipality has, think about that one. What third-party liability do you wind up picking up because you're leasing your facilities to other people. A lot of the cities and the counties that we work with have fairgrounds, they have stadiums, they have other things. Think about what kind of exposures that might create for you when you're working through your planning process, your training, your education process. So, my computer does not want to advance the slide. I apologize. There we go. So I think it's important to start out and understand some of the statistics that go with shootings, that go with deadly weapons events. And this year already, we've had 21 mass shootings with 124 people killed in the United States. That's averaging out to about one shooting every 2 weeks. Mass shootings being shootings where there's been 4 or more deaths. And that is about normal, which is, to use the word normal in that sentence is difficult, but that is about normal for what we have in the United States, about one every 2 weeks. Similarly, an issue that people don't necessarily relate to is that there have been about 2 terrorist plots every month since 2013. Most of those fail because they are intercepted. Since 9/11, the federal government has put in place a very substantial network to monitor and intercede in terrorist-related activities and has been very successful in doing that. That being said, of course, we're never going to be 100% successful, and sooner or later, something does slip through the cracks. So the more we can be monitoring and controlling, and I'll talk to you a little bit further on about how we monitor social media and other channels so that, you get early warning so that even if there is something that slips through the cracks, it's not going to be in one of your communities. So we'll talk more about that as we go on. Municipalities and counties, obviously, you've always been challenged by issues of violence, active shooter. Certainly domestic violence is ubiquitous across the United States. So I think the big change is as a result of the internet and the fact that everyone is carrying some kind of a device that gives them that information immediately. So the expectation of the people in your communities is much higher, and they're looking to the municipalities and the counties to be doing a much higher level of planning, training, education, so that you are prepared for when these things occur. And as we've seen, there have been events that have occurred, buildings, schools, playgrounds. I mean, pretty much we have handled violent events that have occurred everywhere that you can imagine in any kind of a municipality. Also, if you have any healthcare related facilities that your municipality is managing, those tend to be magnets for violence. And they actually need their own plan that may be of a higher level than a lot of your other government buildings. Did I skip? No, there, perfect. So there are, on the first slide, when I talked to you about the fact that everyone thinks, it could never happen here until it does, part of that stems from what we call unknown unknowns. So there's a lot of things that we know, fire, violence, the active shooter, and there used to be some things that we didn't know much about: drones, artificial intelligence, terrorism, cyber terrorism. But there are also things that just, of course, what we call the black swan events, things that just come out of nowhere that hit us. It's very important to be paying attention to what happens around the world and across the country so that we can have a better feel for, that occurred in, another place, another state, another city. We never really thought about that. We haven't incorporated that into our planning, our training, our exercises, anything of that nature. So always upgrading and always looking for those things is going to make a big difference to understanding the risk that your organization faces. So when we talk about risk, it's a very interesting thing. A lot of organizations have a complete grasp on what are their assets, and they have somewhat of a grasp on the threats that those assets face. So, for example, those municipalities that are on the phone today that are hurricane exposed, obviously, you've got plans, process, procedure in place for those things, and for a multitude of other threats. Now, could there be threats that you're not thinking of? Certainly. But if I sat all of you down in a room, my guess is in a few minutes, in 15 minutes on a whiteboard, we would pretty much be able to outline just about every threat that faced a municipal entity. What we don't necessarily have a great grasp on is of the vulnerability. So we've put plans in place, we've got training, we've got education, we've got things, but we don't necessarily know where the gap is. What is going to allow that threat to slip through and affect that critical asset? And that's where the risk lies. So the more we can analyze our vulnerabilities and our threats, we're going to narrow that little risk triangle in the center. And the goal, of course, is to eliminate as many of those vulnerabilities during the planning, training, education process as we can, because the fact that we have a threat is irrelevant if we've got an ironclad way of preventing that threat from impacting our critical assets. So that's really a great way to think about risk. Risk doesn't exist on its own. It's as a result of all three of the pieces. So one of the questions I get all the time, is what is a crisis? And crisis has a big component of preparation. So I'll use, being that I already started talking about hurricane, let's just use that as an example. We deal with a lot of utilities, typically electrical and phone providers. And when they have a hurricane or a tornado or any kind of a natural disaster, and it wipes out service to tens or hundreds of thousands of people, is that a crisis for them? No, not in any way, shape, or form. It is business as usual for them. They are prepared. They know exactly what to do. They've got the plans in place. They deal with it, and it is not a crisis. Yes, it has severely impacted their critical assets, being their poles, their lines, whatever else. And very often they do get a negative reaction from the public because, I'm without power for 2 or 3 days. I'm going to scream and yell. But the reality is, for them, it is not a crisis. They're not only prepared with getting the lines back up, they're prepared with their communications. They're prepared with addressing the concerns of those people who are having the negative reactions. That is not a crisis. A crisis occurs when you're not prepared to address those things. There is a severe impact, and then you get the negative reaction. And that's when the people show up at your board of supervisors meeting or your trustees meeting or whatever else, very negative, and there's no answer to why you weren't prepared. So again, we do a lot of crisis, crisis in quotes, response work, and almost always, I would say in every situation, it's a lack of preparedness that causes those situations to occur. So when you're looking at your crisis management plan, your crisis communications plan, I talked about us whiteboarding all of the vulnerabilities and threats that you have. Well, when we do that, we can also whiteboard what is our response to that situation. What is the communication that goes out with it in our crisis communications plan? Who has the authority to deliver that message? What modality do they use for delivering that message? We can lay all of that out now in peacetime so that we don't wait till something goes wrong before we start doing that. And again, that goes back to that whole concept of preparedness. understanding that what I was just talking about, understanding your risk so that you do empower your people, that people are constantly evaluating and analyzing. They're comparing what has occurred with what might occur. All those kind of things, again, test exercises become very important. So whether they're tabletops, or I know some of the bigger municipalities actually run live scale exercises, participating in as many of those kind of things as you can, taking the incidents and events that you have that occur every day in your city or in your county and using those as a way of testing your plans, testing your people, saying, hey, what if this had escalated to a higher level? What if instead of, it having been dealt with and localized, it had grown? Again, all of those things will help you in determining how you react, when you react, what the extent of your reaction is. So again, preparedness now in peacetime, we can schedule a meeting on the calendar for next week. We can say, okay, guys, we're all going to sit down. We're going to talk about this particular issue, and we're going to address it. That's the time to do it when you're on the calendar. Because I can tell you, and I live this every day, when the call comes in that something has occurred, you're now not on the calendar, you're on the clock. And seconds count. So when seconds count, you can't first be thinking about all of these things. And invariably, when seconds count, what happens is things get missed. So I can lay out with you all of the constituents who need to be communicated with in the event that X, Y, or Z happens. And we can do that today, and we can make that list, and we can say, this is the communication that's going to go out to this particular group, and this is the one that goes out to that particular group. I can tell you, if we try to do that in a crisis environment, we will miss people, we will misstate things, we will put things in a way that we don't want them done. So it is super, super important that you utilize the time that you have now and the experience that you've already got of all your people to analyze what is your risk of crisis and be prepared for it. So we've developed something that we call the ABCs of crisis. And it's a really simple way, but also a way that you can determine whether or not what you're experiencing is going to turn into a crisis. So we talk about anger, blame, and concern. So if there is anger, if people are behaving in a way where they're shocked or they're taking offense to things, if there's unethical behavior, obviously there's going to be anger. And the other thing that you got to be aware of in any kind of a situation, even where it's not yet potentially a crisis, may evolve into a crisis, there is people who will try and stoke the anger. They are going to use the occurrence as their platform to get heard, typically on something else. So if they can inflame your citizens, they can use that for their own purpose. So anger is a very important thing to understand. The next thing is blame. Obviously no one can be blamed for a hurricane. A hurricane is outside of all of our control. However, not having been prepared, not having made sure people were evacuated, not having dealt with the infirm who are elderly or whatever else who are caught in the wake, that's where we get blame. And that can be from a natural disaster, that can be from a man-made cause. So we have to be prepared to deal with the issue of blame. And then just in general, are people concerned? I never thought this could happen in my community, and it has. So now you've made me aware of a situation that I just never would have considered. So you'll remember the water problems and the problems that are continuing to occur in Flint, Michigan as a result of those water problems. There's now a level of concern in that community about illness and about other things that people never would have thought was even possible before it actually came to light. So one of the things we then do with anger, blame, and concern is we measure the extent of the reaction. So spread is very important. How quickly is it spreading? Are we dealing with a viral situation that's out there on the internet, that's out on social media? Or is it really very contained and it's not really going anywhere? Because if it doesn't spread out of control and we can manage the communications around it, it probably does not turn into a crisis. Similarly, speed. So if it's moving very slowly, even if it does spread, we still have the ability to control it. And of course, the setting. Where is it being talked about? Is it online, or is it just word of mouth in the community? How quickly is it getting out, and how broadly is it getting out? So looking at all those things helps us analyze what the response is going to be. And you need to be constantly monitoring that, because as you can imagine, it changes very quickly. And going back to what I said a minute ago about those people who are going to want to use this for their own purposes, you got to be very wary of those people, because they will affect the spread and the speed and the setting, because it's to their advantage to utilize those tools for their own purpose. So again, we need to monitor and pay attention to all of those things. So once you've looked at anger, blame, and concern, and you've looked at the speed and the setting and the spread, you're able to sort of get a feel for the crisis risk level. Now, the crisis risk changes constantly, as I was just saying. So and this is one of the things we have happen literally weekly. We've got an event, it's local, we're handling it, and the New York Times, the Washington Post, the ABC, NBC, national get a hold of it. And it goes from being a local event to being a national event. And obviously the crisis risk level goes up very rapidly in those situations. So again, not all crises are equal. Now, interestingly, one of the things we've seen with the hashtag #MeToo and the sexual abuse and molestation area is that the crisis risk level does not accelerate quickly, because the topic has been so laid out, everywhere in the country. There's almost an expectation that it's going to happen in almost every community. So it doesn't get a lot of play unless there's some new aspect to it, depending on who's involved, what's involved. If it involves a high-profile individual, obviously with the election, the federal election coming up next year, if it involves anyone who's in any way either a candidate or who's speaking out for or against the candidate, all those kind of things. And similarly with violence, the same thing applies. It doesn't have to be in the sexual arena or any other arena. You can have a crisis that is as a result of any of those things. So again, looking at the potential for crisis is important, and understanding how not only how it impacts, but who it impacts is going to be a very important part of that whole process. One of the things that's important to look at and be very aware of when an occurrence happens, before it's turned into a crisis, before anything has happened, you've had some type of negative occurrence. And it may not even, again, it may not have risen to the level where there's a lot of intensity. But the decisions, the actions, and the words that you use are going to be essential to determining, have we got this under control, and does it stay out of that crisis category? Or, unfortunately, as we've all seen, sometimes the decisions, actions, and words cause the crisis. So one of the things we see in almost every case that we get involved in is senior leadership, whether it's mayors, governors, whomever, who want to immediately say something. And typically the reason they want to say something is because they want the world to understand, and I'm putting this in quotes, it wasn't their fault. And, the reality is, if there's been a shooting or if there's been some other kind of act that was a failure, either a failure to respond or whatever it was, there's never going to be a way to explain that it wasn't your fault. So the only kind of communications that take place that are effective in those situations are factual statements of known information. And I'm careful about what I'm saying, factual statements of known information, because invariably in crisis, a certain percentage of what you learn in the first 24 hours is going to be wrong. And if you go out and make statements based on erroneous information, the public is going to assume thereafter that almost everything you say carries a similar risk of either being wrong or being misleading. So again, the planning, training, education that we do now in peacetime is what's going to allow us to make good decisions. We're going to make them quickly because we don't have to first start thinking them through. We're going to take the appropriate actions, and they're going to be accompanied by the appropriate communications. And that makes all the difference in the world when it goes back to anger, blame, and concern. So again, it's super important to think about all these different pieces as we go through. One of the things that when we talk about decisions, validating and understanding all of your emergencies, the risks, the crisis monitoring, those kind of things, identifying the impacts of an incident, providing the leadership as you go along. Again, these are all of the things that you need to be thinking about now as opposed to when something occurs. Because it's not a question of if something's going to occur. It's just a question of when. And all of you have had situations occur. So you know that they can. And therefore, being prepared for them, that is the critical aspect. And by the way, even those things, the unknown unknowns I was talking about earlier, you can have an unknown unknown. And the fact that you've planned for other things will allow you to respond to something different and still have a good outcome. So you may not have been exactly prepared for that particular occurrence, but it's similar to something else that you already have prepared for. And therefore, the outcome will be far better than if you hadn't done the preparation for the other type of event. So again, planning has its own benefit. And I think it was Eisenhower who said, plans are nothing, planning is everything. And there's definitely some truth to that. So one of the things we're trying to do through that planning process now during peacetime is avoid common crisis traps. So one of the things I just mentioned earlier was that everything you learn initially is wrong. Now, obviously not everything, but the facts will change. Invariably, what you initially hear, especially when we're dealing with shootings, if we're dealing with mass shootings, you're going to find out things 10, 12, 24 hours later that are different than what you thought was true to start with. And then again, that thinking that someone didn't know, we didn't know that could have happened, or we didn't do anything wrong. And then subsequently, 12 hours later, we find out, hey, wait a minute, we knew about this a week ago. One of the things that we get regularly, and I mean literally weekly, is how do we respond to the media? I can't tell you how many times I've heard that we have got a great relationship with the media. It's not a problem. And then the media does something that you're just totally caught off guard by, and you're like, these people were my friends. I don't understand. They are not your friends. There's no such thing as off the record. Absolutely, their job is to create controversy. And if they can find that person that I referred to earlier who wants to use this event as a pulpit to speak, and they can get you and that individual in some kind of controversial conversation, that's what sells newspapers. That's what sells airtime. That's exactly where they want to be. So just be extraordinarily careful. Our typical advice is do not engage with the media at all until you have you've used your crisis communications plan and everybody knows what they're doing and where they stand. Typically what we advise in shooting situations is that for the first 48 hours, the only people who you typically see communicating with the press is chief of police, sheriff, whomever is in charge of the investigation. And these statements, again, are very factual in nature. We had X number of people injured. We are addressing it. It is an active crime scene. And as such, there's not much I can share with you. So again, if you guys are ever in those situations, make sure that after you call and speak with your county attorney or your city attorney or whomever else, get someone like me or Jim Satterfield or someone who has dealt with these situations before. A lot of the municipalities we deal with, they work with PR firms. Be very careful about that in crisis. PR firms are peacetime firms. They are doing public relations, just like their name says. Public relations is not crisis communications. And it's very simple. They'll all say they do crisis communications. Really simple. Just ask them to talk to you about the cases that they've handled and the way in which they've handled them. If your crisis manager has never managed a crisis, you need to look somewhere else. So getting those relationships set up in advance is absolutely what you want to do. Again, doing that in peacetime is the time to do it. You do not want to be trying to determine whether you've got the right team after something occurs. So again, those are important things to understand. So from a standpoint of initial response, a little bit of insight, understanding that the incident that you're facing is different from most others that you have faced. In other words, the incident that occurs that's large enough to become a crisis is, for one reason or another, different. Now, it could be that you've had the exact same situation occur, but for some reason, again, there's anger, blame, concern. The press has picked it up for one reason or another. You've got to look at and determine why is this one different, but also understand and don't try and cram it back into the same box, because clearly it's not fitting in the box. And very often crisis events, there's going to be some trauma associated. So obviously in shootings, we always have trauma. But it's interesting that the trauma doesn't always show itself. So we had a shooting in a city 2 years ago where about 6 months later, city employees in other departments started requesting counseling because they were afraid that a similar kind of thing could happen in their department, even though they were nowhere near what actually occurred. But again, it was the unknown that then became known. They suddenly realized, hey, this could happen to me, and that was affecting their job performance. So you've got to always understand that there's a life cycle to a crisis. And you got to look, what does it look like a day, a week, a month, a year? What does the 1 year anniversary of the crisis look like? So for example, I'm speaking to you from the state of Colorado. There is an annual occurrence around the shooting that occurred at Columbine, and now we're 20 years out, and still people remember it. So much so that it's branded that school. That the kids that go to that school, when they go and apply for a job, they go for a job interview, and on their resume, the people interviewing them see that they went to the Columbine High School. One of the first questions they get asked is, "Oh, tell me about the shooting." And those kids say, "I wasn't even alive when it occurred." So you've got to be, that's the extreme case, but in other words, you've got to be aware that crises don't go away. They morph and change. And one of the things we want to very much make sure of is that it doesn't brand your community. So I was the person who got the call from Dr. Steger at Virginia Tech when the shootings took place there. One of the things we were very aware of is that we didn't want that school to get branded the same way that Columbine did. And we put in place a whole program to make sure that that didn't happen, and we were very successful. So again, one of the things that we would like to make sure is that if your community ever has any kind of major adverse event, again, thinking about brand and reputation, thinking a year out, thinking 5 years out, how does it affect our economic development? All of those kind of things, we can do that now in peacetime, and we can do it well. It's not something we want to try to do during the event, and it's not even something we want to do with the emotion that's going to be in place for a week, a month, 6 months after the event. So again, planning now is the time. Going back to the issue of what can you say to the press, I mentioned that we very much encourage that right after any significant event, that it's the facts only that are being presented, and typically by those people who have the facts. So whether it be the investigating officers, the chief of police, whomever. One of the things that we're very comfortable, obviously, with a community leader, whether it's a mayor or board of trustees or a governor or whomever, things, our thoughts and prayers are with those that were impacted and with their families. Obviously, we want to say those kind of things. We want to be very, we can't be empathetic to the situation, and this is something we have to be careful about. We're certainly sympathetic, but one of the things we need to do is we need to train our spokespeople. So if we're going to let the mayor speak, we got to make sure he doesn't say things like, "I know how you feel." No, you don't. You cannot possibly be empathetic with those people unless, and we have had this situation a couple of times, they have actually been through the same experience. So training your speakers so that they are only saying things that work and aren't going to come back to haunt them is very important. So again, we can do training for whomever your designated spokesperson is. We can do that now during peacetime and get them up to speed. We can put them in front of a camera. We can put microphones in front of their face. We can make it feel real. And it's interesting. You'd be surprised how much your heart rate goes up and how anxious you get, even though it's just an exercise and that no one's on the other end of that TV camera. But it is amazing how valuable that training and education can be now. So I very much encourage those kind of exercises. One of the things that I point out to people all the time, a firm like ours, we talk about crisis management. It's very rare that we get called in when the crisis is occurring. We're not actually managing the crisis. So, for example, this morning I got a call from a municipality where they had a shooting 8 days ago. So clearly, I'm not involved in any way in the crisis management. What we're doing is we're helping to manage the consequences of the decisions, actions, and words that either were used or maybe we're lucky and we get to assist to make sure the proper ones are used so that the consequences are managed to the greatest extent possible. Again, when you consider the fact that we handle somewhere between 3 and 5 crises a week, and we've been doing it for 15 years, there's very little that we haven't seen or dealt with. And therefore, we know what the consequences are. We know what occurred when someone made a certain decision or statement. So again, managing those consequences is very important. You know, one of the things you'll see on this slide on the end, it says monitor open source intelligence and social media in the aftermath of an event. We do that on behalf of our clients because what happens is invariably something has occurred and people start talking about it. They start chattering about it on social media. And listening to what they say can be very important because you find out things that you just wouldn't have otherwise known. And sometimes they're very valuable things, and sometimes they also help you prevent, you know, an additional occurrence. So we could talk more about that kind of thing, but I mean, we could do a whole separate webinar just on talking about how we monitor and control information. So if anyone has questions about that, don't hesitate to contact me after the webinar. So one of the things, you know, I just mentioned, the crisis is very short-lived, but the consequences go on pretty much forever. For those of you who don't know, that flower that you see in the right-hand corner there, that is the columbine. I live in the state of Colorado. The columbine is our state flower. And I will tell you, I don't think I've ever heard the word columbine used in the state of Colorado in reference to the flower. It has become, you know, basically, it is the standard word for using when people are talking about school shootings. So with that, Dan, I'm going to turn it back to you. I don't know if anybody has submitted questions. But
don't have any questions, Harry, but you've done a fantastic job thus far. So let's see if there's any questions out there. Anybody have anything they want to ask? Any issues that are presenting themselves at this point in time within your areas that you think that Harry or his company might be able to provide some level of assistance? Let me just talk to a few people on the line and see if they have any thoughts. Mia, are you out there? Maya?
Yes, I am.
Any thoughts? Any questions?
Dan, you're doing to Mia now what my professors used to do to me in law school, which is not really fair. You know, you're putting her on the spot.
That's what I'm best known for, is putting people on the spot. So you don't have to.
Mia, you can just say no.
Yeah, you can just say no. That's fine.
Any suggestions on like peacetime training? Could you?
Yeah, I think, you know, peacetime training has to be something that occurs as a result of a completed plan. So it doesn't matter whether you've got a plan for just one small piece or whether you've completed your overall emergency response, crisis management, continuity plan. But don't do training around anything that you don't have complete planning in place, because again, you're training to a plan, and if you try to do anything else, it really doesn't go well.
Okay, thank you.
Very good, thank you. That was a great question. Let's see if anybody else. We got a couple of. Can we update and print a copy of the presentation? Yes, I'll be sending out the copy and the recording later. Again, I got a comment. Great presentation. Is there any training available for the crisis manager? Everybody has the first crisis. Any thoughts on that?
One of the most important things that you can do is train your crisis manager. And I know that Jim Satterfield, Dan, is planning on working with you to do exactly that, to provide crisis manager training, you know, specifically. So we will definitely be working with you on that.
Very good. That's an excellent segue. We will be building a much stronger relationship with crisis risk, and we'll be doing some webinars and some things. So a great question, great way to segment. But I thank you all for your presentation. Thank you so much, Harry. Did a fantastic job. Lots of Lots of great feedback. Another comment, great presentation, lots of good information. So we will be in contact. Thank you so much. Enjoy the dry weather of Colorado.
I will try to do that.
And we'll talk later. Thank you, everybody, and we'll talk to everybody later. Again, I'll be sending out the recording, the presentation, and contact information if you want to have any questions later. So thank you guys very much. Appreciate it.
And Dan, I'll send you over that PowerPoint as soon as we get off the call.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.